Hello and welcome to The Game Changers. I'm Sue Anstiss and this is the podcast where you'll hear from trailblazing women in sport who are literally knocking down the barriers and challenging the status quo for women and girls everywhere. I'd like to say before we start a massive thank you to Barclays, who have once again come on board to sponsor this series of The Game Changers. There's no doubt that few brands have done more for women's sport. Barclays, they're currently title sponsor of the Women's Super League, and they also back the FA in the fantastic work it does to ensure that every schoolgirl across the country has a chance to play football by 2024. I'm so excited to introduce my guest today. It's Kelly Cates, one of Britain's top broadcasters. I've no doubt you already know of Kelly. You've seen her on television or heard her on radio. She currently fronts Sky Sports coverage of the Premier League and BBC 5 Live's coverage across a range of sporting events, including the World Cup, Olympics and Premier League. Kelly also presents a weekly show on the Global Premier League channel with a former guest on this podcast, Ian Wright. In a different world, I might have been talking to Kelly about mathematics. I asked her what happened there.
It was just what I was good at school. I kind of went towards the sciences. I did all science A-levels. I did further maths A-level. And the reason it didn't work out is because, there's a couple of reasons. One is I think I went to university too soon. I think I should have had a year off. I think I just was sick of studying. Yeah. And I remember kind of drifting in a maths lecture and then coming to and thinking, do you know what they're talking about is actually really interesting. I wish I was engaged and switched on. But by then it had sort of drifted and I was looking for ways to get out, and Sky Sports News was being set up and they said, we don't need people who have experience. And I thought, that's me. I have no experience. That's perfect.
And before, I'd like to talk to you more about your first role at Sky, but as I said, your whole life is very much bound up with football. So does it dominate even your earliest memories of childhood? Is football very central to that?
Yeah, and I don't have that memory of the first game I ever went to. It wasn't a watershed occasion for me. My mum used to take us, when we moved down to Liverpool, my mum used to take us when I was about 2 and my brother was 6 months. So she'd sit with a toddler and a wriggling baby and everything. And so I don't remember not being there. And my memories aren't really of the football. My memories are of the other kids and the other players' families and the sort of halftime and post-match stuff. That's what I remember. So I think that's really helped with feeling comfortable in a football environment because it's all the aspects of it feel natural to me.
And were school friends, ever envious of you rubbing shoulders with the great and the good of football, or did they not really have an idea of the other side of your life?
I think partly it was a different era and football wasn't seen then as it is now. It was still a big deal. And, I grew up near Liverpool and went to school there, obviously. But I think really I was with my friends through most of my school life. So they weren't really that impressed or bothered or even took much notice. Occasionally something would happen. And I remember when Dad resigned from Liverpool, one of my friends talked to me about it and she said she'd gone home and her mum was like, oh, Kenny's gone. And there was this, when we were talking about it, there was this sense of Kelly's dad and then there was Kenny who's at Liverpool. It was two different people. I think that's how I heard it anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I wonder whether there was a time at which you realised your dad was famous, but ultimately he was your dad, wasn't he?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I don't really think there was ever a moment where I thought, oh my, there are maybe instances where I realised, but it was, it's a strange thing because it was completely normal for me to go to a ground and have people singing his name. That wasn't strange to me. Because I was so little. And when you're little, the weirdest things seem normal. You're just like, that's how life is. And also because it was a real team thing. It wasn't about him in particular. Yeah, it didn't strike me as strange.
I love that. And did you ever think about playing football?
No, it wasn't really something that was it wasn't something that I even considered. It wasn't something that, I think most people who play football start by kicking a ball in the playground, and we never did that. So I think if you miss out on that first step, then you don't look for the next ones. You don't look for an organised version of the sport. Or I remember going to the Women's Cup final years ago with my mum when I was quite young, and we were there, and somebody was trying to talk me into it, saying, "Well, it's never too late to start." And I thought, no. There's no way I'm going in with a load of people who've been playing for years. It was maybe in my teens or something. I wasn't, properly grown up, and I wasn't a kid. But I was like, no. There's too many people who've had too much practice. I'm not doing that.
What about you and me doing a bit of walking football in a few years' time?
Yeah, exactly. Might try that one.
Getting back to your first role at Sky, and you mentioned what they were looking for. But what was the appeal for you coming from the background that you had?
One was not being at university anymore. I was ready to leave. But I've been quite flippant about that, about ending, but I really was desperate for most of my degree just to get out and work. I wanted a job. I didn't want to be studying. So that was part of it. But the fact that it was a job that was so sort of exciting, and it was something that I hadn't considered. It seemed to me that it was something that if that's what you wanted to do, you had to plan your life really carefully in order to get to that point. Then it would happen. And that just isn't how it worked out. Suddenly Sky Sports News was invented. They had to fill 24 hours of sport a day, which there was lots of discussion as to whether that would be possible. It was an experiment. So they wanted young, enthusiastic people to come in and sort of trial it for them.
And Sky's obviously had its fair share of scandal around sexism in the past. So right back at the start, you said you were there at the very beginning, weren't you? What was that atmosphere like, especially for a young woman coming in?
Well, I wasn't part of the main sports department. In Sky Sports News, we were very separate. So when we started, there were, they had a few grown-ups in charge of us, but mainly we were kids in our 20s, in our early 20s, who were, we sort of created our own world, really. The head director there was a woman, Karen Wilmington, who was fantastic. And it's only now looking back that I realised how quietly and sometimes vociferously supportive that she was. But we were a really tight group of quite strong-minded women who were there. And they're still some of my best friends to this day. And we didn't have that competitive edge between us. We weren't all scrabbling over each other to get on. We were all in this brand new situation and giddy with it. And we were each other's because it was 24-hour sports news. Our hours were really antisocial. So, the women on screen and the production team behind the scenes, and that wasn't all male either. It didn't feel like a sexist environment to me at the time because we were all on a level. So I think that's one of the big issues is that, I think sexism becomes an issue when there's a power imbalance. I think that's at the heart of it. And I think we never felt that because we were all starting off on the same level.
And how much did the fact that you, as you've said, you felt a part of football help you in those early years at Sky? And do you think being Kenny Dalglish's daughter meant you were respected because you clearly knew your subject without perhaps having to prove it like other women coming into sport?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. There was an assumption that I knew what I was talking about, certainly as far as football was concerned, or that even if I don't know, if players of 20 years before we started were mentioned, I would know who people were talking about. Or there was just in those small conversational moments, it was easy to have a football conversation. I mean, obviously the way you know football when you work in it is different from how you know football as a fan. And so the knowledge you need to work in it is different. It's much more kind of clear and statistical. Whereas as a fan, it's more emotional, I think. And I think, you have to try and get that balance. So yeah, there was still a lot to learn, but I don't feel I had to prove that I liked football, which I think is the first hurdle that a lot of women come up against.
Yeah. And were you ever concerned, there's obviously the positive side of whose daughter you were, but were you ever concerned that people felt you were making a living off of his reputation? Was that ever a concern to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be an issue moving into his world, really. Although the media was very much not his world, but moving into football was always going to be an issue. But I think you have to deal with life how it is. And it took a while, I think, for me to kind of be able to say, well, yeah, that is what he does. And this is what I do. And they are related. And that's part of what I have to deal with. There's no point fighting it. There's no point in constantly trying to kind of defend myself against it, because now I can look at it as, from decades distant and say, well, of course it was a factor in why they would put me on screen. Of course it helps to publicize a new channel to have his name attached to it, even, by proxy. So I can see it. I can see it now. But at 21, 22, I was thinking, oh, this is amazing. They've clearly seen this potential talent in me. And it's rubbish. It's just nonsense. But it didn't occur to me at the time, but I see it now from a distance.
Yeah. And it could be both, that they also saw the huge talent that you too.
I wouldn't say that. I would say maybe a sort of basic level of competence that could possibly be drawn out of me, I think, at that stage.
You're too humble. You obviously asked a lot about your dad, but how has your mum influenced your life and career too?
Well, my mum's actually a much bigger influence on my life, because dad was away, and, he was either had matches away, or he'd be on pre-season tours, or he'd be away for the summer doing different things. And it wasn't that he wasn't around or he wasn't available, but my mum was the ever present. And so it's much more around her. And I think being a woman in football, I think a lot of the lessons I learned about that are from mum, in how to be yourself, but also be aware that you are in a man's world. And I think the world of media around football isn't particularly a man's world anymore, still slightly, and they're still not completely balanced. But the world of football is, because the men, and the world of football that I work in is because it is male players and male coaches. And that's who I'll deal with. And by and large, male pundits, with the odd exception. So I think, like I say, about having to accept the world the way it is, that is the case. It is the men's game that I work in. It's not for me to go in and say, you should all behave like women, whatever that means, because they're not women. That's not the world I work in. So yeah, it would be different, I think, if I worked in the women's game, or if it was a different, but that's not how my life is. And it's not the way I work. I heard a fantastic quote. There's a podcast called The Guilty Feminist. And they have this section on it that is, I'm a feminist, but. And this woman, I can't remember her surname. Her surname, Poppy is her name. And she's the lipstick queen. She does that lipstick brand. And she went on and she said, I'm a feminist, but any success I've had is down to pandering to male egos. And I thought, yeah, I recognize that. Yeah, it has to be. Yeah,
I love that. In your TV work, you obviously mentioned that you've worked at many different channels, including Setanta, ESPN, ITV, channels 4 and 5. Are female presenters viewed differently, do you think, around the world in different places?
I know in the US it's different. Rebecca Lowe does a fantastic job and is respected, and it feels like it wasn't really an issue. When you look at her social media and the comments underneath, there isn't that sexist spin on them, by and large. Certainly not to the extent that there is in the UK. And I think that goes away for women over time. Yeah. But I think it's definitely something that's thrown out early doors. Not completely, but it dissipates. And I think that's probably affected by the fact that women's football or women's soccer is bigger in America than the men's game. They're more successful. They are the superstars. So I think there isn't that question of, oh, you're coming into a man's world, because it's neither one thing or another. It is just the football world. Elsewhere across Europe, I don't know. I don't really know how it's.
No, I'm asking a question. I don't know the answer either. It would be interesting to know at some point in terms of Germany and France, and how, if they've got female commentators and pundits too.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are female commentators and pundits and presenters, but I don't know how that's seen.
Different, no. And Ian Wright, who obviously you've worked with for years on BBC 5 Live, he was talked on this podcast and about the fact that he believes women presenting sport have to work harder than men, especially when it comes to punditry. Do you think that's the case too?
Definitely in terms of punditry. I think there's no margin for error. There is no understanding of human frailty when it comes to women, especially in terms of pundits. I think as a presenter, it's not quite the same, because you're not giving your opinion in the same way, or at least you shouldn't be giving your opinion if you're doing the job properly.
Yeah.
But I think with pundits, it's different, because there will always be a natural conversation and debate, and that's reasonable. But then the level of debate sinks, and I think women get a very different kind of abuse from the abuse that men get if they put out a controversial opinion. So, yeah, and I think if a woman throws out a lazy opinion, which I think that male pundits have been guilty of, then I think it's picked up on immediately. I think it's getting better. I do think it's getting better.
Yeah. And what about the fans? So how have things changed over the last 20 years in terms of their acceptance of women daring to talk about men's football?
I mean, it has changed, but I think there have always been women in football whose opinions and whose place there hasn't been questioned. You know, I hear a lot of people talking at the moment about trailblazers, and I think, well, there were women working in football when I was young. I remember it. This isn't. There's nobody. I think there are issues around race and sexuality that are definitely barriers that still need to be broken down. I think in terms of sexism, I know that when I was young, I mean, Hazel Irvine was working on football, and there were names. Gabby was presenting the, and obviously I was working by then, but Gabby was presenting the Champions League in 2005, 2006. You know, I don't think there have been no role models. I don't think, and I don't think there were massive outcries around that at the time. I think that women who are good at their job have always been accepted. I think that the social media culture means that the people who complain about it have their voices amplified. I think that they know that and that they play on that. But I think generally, in terms of speaking to people and the people I come across, I just don't think there is that level of being anti-women in football that exists in that social media world, because those very insignificant voices are given a distorted platform, I think.
That's really interesting, isn't it? And I think, because I do think you're right, it's much amplified. How do you personally deal with that social media negativity, any trolls? Do you have any approaches that you take to not let that get inside your head, as it were?
Yeah, I put my quality filters on. I block merrily. I block people who are rude to other women. I block people who, I sometimes go into topics and look for them because I know that I'll find the trolls in there. And what's really interesting is once you get rid of a few, it's like they fall like dominoes, because they all feed off each other. And I think there's lots of them with multiple accounts. And so I think once you get rid of a few and a little sort of cabal of them, they're gone. And if you block them, they don't appear on your timeline. They can't reply to you. So if other women are reading my posts and the replies underneath it, they don't see the trolls because they can't access my timeline. So I think that's really important as well. There's it's not just about protecting myself. It's about the fact that I stop that appearing on the platform in the first place.
And the quality filters, I saw you share something on that, actually.
Oh, it's my thing. It's my big bugbear. I'm like, just turn your quality filter on.
Yeah, I didn't even know about it. I didn't know about it until I saw you shared it. So that obviously has made a difference, and good to let people know that that's an option to do.
This is not about serious abuse and threats on social media. This is about kind of the low level, just nastiness and silliness. And I think that you shouldn't have to deal with it. These are people who in real life you would walk away from, you wouldn't mix with, you wouldn't be in their company. So don't invite them into your virtual world. Don't let them be in that space for you. This is your world. Set your boundaries, allow the people in who you want to allow in, and get rid of everybody else.
I love that. Getting back to your sort of on-air relationship with Righty, but you seem to have such a lovely informal way in which you work together. How important do you think it is to have that connection with a co-host and the wider production team too?
Hugely important. I see that as a really big part of my job. I want people to feel relaxed and comfortable, and I want them to be talking before we even get on air, because I think then you sort of hit the ground running. You're already working things through and even if you're talking, I talk rubbish when we're sitting watching games sometimes, just to try and keep people talking, because I think it just keeps the energy levels up. You can see it. And if there's a game on and it's not a great game, and I think at the moment, during the pandemic, there've been some games where you just think, all just, it's not a good game. There's no fans there. It all just feels a little bit kind of like an exercise in futility. You have to keep everybody talking, because if they don't, then when you come on air, it will feel flat. And if I'm watching, I don't want you to be sitting there looking sulky because you have to cover football for a living. I don't want to see that. That's ridiculous. So yeah, it's that. I think that's a big part of my job is making sure that those energy levels are good.
And without naming any names, but have you worked across other presenters where you felt you couldn't gel with them? And how do you deal with that? Because we don't get on with everybody in life, do we always?
Yeah, I've worked with a couple of people very, very briefly on not anything particularly long term, where I felt that I couldn't. And I do really try hard to kind of, because I think it's important. And I think you don't need to particularly like somebody or want to be their best friend, but there needs to be a way of working together. And yeah, there is one person who I sort of, when I say lost my temper with on air, what I mean is I didn't do what I should have done in a circumstance, which is be a helpful, supportive co-host. I let them tie themselves in knots over something. And I just thought, it's just mean. And also it's not serving the viewer for me to behave like that. It's petty and silly. And I did do it once. I'm not particularly proud of it, but I think, but it is really important. You know, for the amount of time you're on air, you can have a working relationship with somebody, and you have to have it because like I said, it's about serving the viewer.
And have you ever been made to feel sort of second to a man that you've co-hosted with? I feel like we see that more in US television sometimes, don't we, with a kind of main host and a co-host. But
yeah, I think in sports news in the early days, but that's because I was junior. So It wasn't because I was a woman. So I think then there became a time where I was kind of stretching a bit within those confines. And I was thinking, but I have moved on and I am. But then, I mean, again, I don't think it's purely being a female thing. I think it's that you're seen with people that you've worked with for a long time, you're always seen as a beginner until you do something to kind of break out of that, or until somebody else comes up behind you who is a beginner, and then so that there is that perception of it. And I've never been made to feel like that with a male co-presenter ever, who's kind of patronized me or acted as though I wasn't on a level with them. At least not as a grown-up presenter. Definitely when I was a junior and when I was little, then yes, but not as a grown-up.
And you were the first female presenter on TalkSport, and I know you've said of almost that whole not being a trailblazer, but did it feel momentous at the time that you were breaking new ground?
No, and I feel like it should have done. And then I'm not sure I knew it at the time. I think maybe I don't know if maybe I was the first permanent one, and there'd been there were definitely other female voices on the station. I know that Robin used to work on the news, and that's just the first name that springs to mind. So I think there were other female voices. Faye Carruthers, I think, was maybe doing stuff there at the same time as well. So I didn't feel like a trailblazer in that sense. Like I said, I think when I hear women saying, I can't find women in who do what I want to do, I think it strikes me that they're not looking hard enough, and they're not, it makes me wary of them. It makes me think they're not watching enough or listening to enough football, because I always sought out the women around me, and I did it unconsciously. I didn't look for a mentor, and I didn't look for someone whose path I could follow. I just naturally gravitated towards the women that I worked with and whose voices I heard.
It's difficult really to talk to you and not mention Hillsborough, which must have had such a profound effect on your life and your family as you were growing up as a girl. So how difficult was it for you to create that powerful documentary for 5 Live and relive that day personally for yourself?
It was, I'd made a documentary with a friend of mine, John Osborne, for the 20th anniversary. And he was, he's a television producer and director, and he put it together. And then we sort of worked together on turning that into a radio documentary on the 20th anniversary. And that was huge for me, because I revisited it as an adult and a mother. And I found that, and I was pregnant at the time when I was listening to a lot of the tapes. And that was really hard to have that new perspective on it and to have that deeper level of understanding. I'm not talking about how it affected me. I mean, that kind of understanding of how it affected people who'd lost their children, people who'd lost parents and friends and family, and the people who are still affected by it to this day, which is something that isn't often remarked upon, are the long-term effects on the people who survived and the long-term effects on the people who were bereaved as well. So to go back and do the documentary after the verdicts, I wasn't at all convinced that the verdict would go the way that it did, because there'd been so many setbacks before. And I knew what had happened. I just didn't have any faith in the system to prove that. So I was driving up to Salford to go and work on this documentary. But I left, in order to be there in time, I had to leave before the verdicts were delivered. And I had to stop at the side of the road because I didn't realise how affected I would be hearing the verdicts. And I was just sobbing because it was so, I don't know, relief, and just that sense of all those people who'd been frustrated and saying, we've been through this terrible experience, we're telling you what happened and nobody will listen, nobody will believe us. The trauma of that is extraordinary. So I got to the studio, and a guy called Tim Peach had worked on this documentary, and he'd put something together with Ellie Oldroyd a couple of years before. So he had the sort of bones of this documentary, but because of legal issues, he couldn't put the whole thing together in the way that it was. He was just fantastic for somebody who went in cold, effectively. You know, he hadn't lived through it. It wasn't part of his life. He was aware of it. But he immersed himself in it, and he just put together the most perfect people who represented different aspects of the issue and who could talk eloquently and emotionally about it. And it was, you know, a lot of it, I just sat back and listened to them. That was the sort of the power of their voices, really. But yeah, Tim put so much work into that, and the people who spoke on the documentary were just brilliant. And I think there was a sense of having the sort of shackles taken off them when they were trying to talk. This sense of being able to breathe and say, I can say this, and I know people will believe me and they will understand.
Yeah, no, it was so powerful. And I think, like you, clearly I had in no way the same connection to it, but I felt I knew the story and listened to the documentary just completely. And as a mother too, just some of the, I guess, on the day experience also was just all the more shocking than I think it was when I'd first heard about it. So no, so powerful. You were once praised for the interview that you did with your dad, you know, around that documentary. He was obviously Liverpool manager at the time. How do you prepare for that from a professional point of view? And it's such a deeply personal conversation to have too.
Well, we knew what we wanted because I'd spoken to Tim about how we wanted to put it in, and I knew how he would react to it. So I knew where he would go, and we wanted to talk about his involvement. And I knew that he would say, this is not about me, this is about the, you know, and so I was sort of trying to preempt that to get him to talk more about his own experiences of it. So there was a little bit of it that was professional, about trying to keep a distance from it and work out what was best for the documentary. And there was another bit that was personal, that was, I know what you're going to say. Don't palm me off. I know you.
And I want to move on, if I can, just to talk a bit more about some of the more recent chapters in your career. So you returned to Sky in 2016 and became the host of Premier League matches in 2017. Were you personally surprised at all to come back a bit later in your career and have that amazing opportunity?
Yeah, it came out of the blue, really. Right. I had very early conversations about going back. And then, as you say, I went back to work on the EFL before I moved on to the Premier League. And I didn't really know what I was having a coffee about. I didn't really know what we were chatting about. They didn't really, but it was are you vaguely open if this were to be suggested kind of conversation? And I thought, yeah, that'd be really, really nice to go and do, actually. And it was strange going back, though, because the buildings are completely different. It's this huge campus now, and it was all very different. The old Sky Sports News building has gone, and it doesn't exist anymore. And it was but then I'd be standing in the canteen getting a coffee, and I'd see somebody that I hadn't seen for 10 years, and I was like, oh my God, how are you? So it was a really strange but lovely experience.
And why do you think you've had such longevity and success across your career? How do you personally measure that success?
I think I haven't planned. I think I've been adaptable. We've talked about being a parent. I think at that stage I sort of accepted that I was going to step back a little bit because I wanted to be at home a bit more. But I tried to keep my hand in a little bit, even if it was a day a week somewhere or just something, so that when I wanted to go back a bit more, I wasn't building new bridges. I was just kind of, I was already a little bit in the door. And I think it's about so much of this job is about luck and opportunity. There are only so many jobs around, and there has to be a space. And if there isn't a space, it doesn't matter how good you are, how hard you work, you can't get the job. There isn't a space there. So I just took what was offered to me a lot of the time. And everything that I did, I've done so many different aspects of the job. And I thought, well, even if it's not exactly what I want to do right now, I'm going to go and do it. And everything's a learning experience. You take bits of everything. So whether it's pitch side reporting, or whether it's doing the 606 fan phone-in, or whether it's hosting live football, or a much more structured kind of news environment, sports news environment, everything you do, you learn a little bit from, and you work out which part to use where.
Interesting. I guess we're seeing more ex-female players coming in and trying their hands at pundits and as pundits and commentators in football, but across other sports too. So if you had to give some advice to women wanting to try and find those roles as they exist as broadcasters on TV and radio, what would you say? Clearly take a little bit of all the different opportunities that arise.
Take every opportunity you get. Nothing is wasted. Not a second that you spend on air is wasted. Even the conversations that you might have, projects that don't come off the ground, it's all useful. The way you talk to people, the people that you talk to, I think it's different, slightly different advice for young women maybe coming out of school or university and starting off in their career to somebody who's coming out of the professional game and moving into punditry. But I think for somebody right at the beginning of their career, it's always really basic advice. It's turn up on time, work well with people, but don't be a doormat, but work well with people and ask questions and be involved and just be enthusiastic, because people will remember you. And I think that's advice for anybody starting in any job. But I would say get all the minutes you can under your belt. If it's a 5-minute slot, if it's, there's times when, I've done 3 minutes at 6:20 in the morning and then gone back home and done it because it's all useful, it's all helpful, and it all adds up.
How interesting, yeah. And what do you think makes a great interviewer? What would be the recipe for a fantastic sports interviewer?
Caring what people think, not just listening, but listening properly. The wrong attitude to go in is what's the right question, unless the reason you're asking that is how do I best get the right answer? Because an interview will always be remembered for the answers rather than the questions. And so the question's only there as a function to get the best answer out of somebody. You want to steer people to areas where you get the best out of them. This isn't politics. It's not about tripping people up. It's about getting information and about enhancing the whole experience.
That's fantastic advice for my podcasting questions too. How much do you worry about your appearance on screen? And do you think that's still more of an issue for women than it is for men?
It is a different issue for women than it is for men. I think men will be criticised for how they look. If men have outlandish fashion choices, then that will be commented on, because by and large, a football audience is a very conservative with a small c audience. I think, though, that the way it affects women is different, because I think women's identity is often quite deeply tied up in how they look. We hear female athletes talking about at the beginning of their careers, they don't want to train too much. They don't want to change their physicality. That's something they have to come to terms with. Historically and socially, women are judged on how they look ahead of what they do or what they say. And so I think there is something really deep rooted in women so our response to being criticised for how we look is different from how men respond, I think, because we're told it's important about us. So my way of dealing with that is to try and keep it as basic as possible. I think that's my job, is to be slightly unobtrusive as well.
Yeah.
That's I'm a facilitator,
you're not the story.
The kind of be all and end all. Yeah. So that's partly reflected in the way I kind of dress on air. Although since lockdown, I've had the same 3 dresses pretty much on rotation. 3 black and navy wrap dresses that I've just kind of had. I'm just like, nobody cares. I think my sister said, somebody said on Twitter, bloody hell, does she only have one dress? I said, if it was only one person, I don't care. So people don't really notice. It's not, if you keep it, that's the other reason, is on a purely practical level, it just saves having a kind of wardrobe of stuff to pick from. I've got a uniform for work, basically, and it stops me having to think too much.
Like Barack Obama, that was his thing, isn't it? Same clothes every day, then you haven't got to engage your decision-making process.
That's a really good point. Lots of successful people do it, whether it's Steve Jobs with the black T-shirt and black trousers, or something. It's, if you have a uniform, it means you can carry on with your job, and you're not thinking. I mean, look, although having said that, if you love clothes, then Gabby loves clothes, and she always looks immaculate. She's always beautifully dressed, and you can tell she's like flicked through Vogue and is taking inspiration from there. And I love that about her, and it doesn't detract at all from what she does, because she's brilliant and she's hugely respected. So I don't think this is advice for everybody, but for me, as somebody that isn't part of who I am. I quite like clothes, but I don't love clothes. So it's not part of my identity. So it doesn't bother me too much to keep it basic. That helps me.
Excellent, no, indeed. And you've got such a relaxed, natural way of presenting. So has your style changed over the years, do you feel?
Yeah, I definitely, when I started, it's just a natural kind of, it's a natural sort of defense mechanism that you become very structured. You stick to, it's like coloring within the lines, and you say, I'm going to do this. And I know that the way that certain people phrase things traditionally in football is like this. And there are, there's a pattern. If you listen to news bulletins or to news reports, there's a pattern, there's a rhythm to how they talk. And it's very comforting. So it's easy to slip into that. But I think 2 things have happened. One is I've got more experienced and confident as I've got on, and I'm happier talking in my own voice. And sometimes if a producer's moving me on, they'll sometimes give me information in their own words. And I think, no, don't do that, because then I have to unscramble it and then scramble it back into my own words again. And because I know when something doesn't sound natural. And the other thing is that I think just across the board, that style has become more popular, of a more kind of natural presenting. It isn't as formal as it used to be. There is a much more, and I think a lot of that is to do with podcasts and how people watch and listen to football. So that style is much more appreciated now.
That's interesting. And do you think you'll be able to continue as a sports reporter until you choose to retire? If you think about Des Lynam presenting for 40 years, whatever, do you think there'll be that opportunity?
I would hope so. Yeah. I mean, Sue Barker worked until she chose. I think Claire Balding will be able to work until she chooses. She's not at the stage yet where she's trying to. So I think, I don't know. I think there is a shelf life, and I think that television and broadcasting is something that changes all the time. It's something that always looks for innovation. It always looks for the new. So it might be like my role adapts as I get older. What I don't want to become is one of those people who grumbles every time somebody young gets a job. I just don't want to be that person. And I'm so I see it, and I think, and I see the warning signs in myself, sort of going. And you think, you started out too. Don't do this. Don't judge somebody who's starting out by the same criteria that you would judge somebody who's been doing this for 30 years. It's not fair. Yeah. So I hope I'll be able to work for as long as I choose. I think probably my role will have to adapt. And I desperately do not want to become one of those people who grumbles and says, well, people nowadays, they just don't know what they're doing, because every generation does it, and I'm determined not to. The angry reaction we've seen to the potential European Super League just highlighted how
central football is really to the culture of this country. So what is it that you personally love about football, would you say?
I love, in a work sense, I love when I walk into a ground early and nobody's really there and the stewards are starting to get the stadium ready, and you hear them muttering and they're trying out I've been at Wembley preparing for a cup final when they're hanging the nets on and the band's rehearsing, and I love that sense of occasion, the sense of it all. It's why I miss fans so much in the grounds, and that sense of going on air and the noise levels and the energy levels building around us as we go on, and everything feeds into that. I love that sense of it. I love the unpredictability of it. I love that moment before a goal's scored when there's that intake of breath where people go, and then there's that outpouring. I love the chaos of it. I think it has to be an emotional attachment. Football at its best, there's just nothing like it for that sense. I love last minute goals. I love last minute disputed, horrible goals that get scuffed across the line, and then I love those beautifully crafted, gorgeous pieces of skill that just make you, I don't know, that just make you gasp. And I love all of it. But I think it's all a lot less meaningful without fans in there. That is, I've realised during this, and I always kind of knew, but I really realised that it feels meaningless without seeing the people who it matters to. You need to have that as your background to it. It's like watching gigs when there isn't a crowd there. It's like, you need that kind of, that energy around. Yeah, you need it.
And clearly you've had an extraordinary career, but as you look back, is there anything that you think you would do differently if you had the chance? Are there any regrets of decisions taken at all?
I don't think so. I think to be where I am without having planned it right now, where I've got a little bit of live football for the telly, I've got a little bit of radio, which can either be live football or a longer form discussion. I do a programme with Righty on the worldwide kind of coverage of the Premier League, which is like a 90-minute kind of discussion show about whatever we feel like. It's really sort of open-ended with lovely guests on it. And I think everything that I've done has sort of added up to me being here right now. And so, no, there isn't a decision that I regret. There isn't a job I regret taking or an experience I wish I hadn't had. There's been stuff I enjoyed more than others, but I'm glad I took every single one of those opportunities. And I'm also glad that I took the decision to step back from things when I did as well, because, that's quite a scary thing to do when you are self-employed, to go, do you know what, I'm done with this now. I can't give it anymore.
Yeah. That's
quite a scary thing to do. But I'm glad I did that at the time it did, because it's opened up other opportunities.
And finally, looking forward, is there an ambition or a dream that you still hold either in work life or life generally, or something that you would love to achieve in the future?
I'm not a planner. I just don't, it's not in my nature to plan. I don't know, I think partly it's just, I'm just not like that. And the other thing is superstition. I hate to have a vision in my head, because then I think it could just be snatched away from me. So that I think that's why. I think I just kind of go, do you know what, whatever happens, and just be grateful for it and enjoy it. I'm really happy with the way work is at the moment. So it feels greedy to want more, to keep looking for the next thing. And you can't enjoy anything if you're constantly looking for the next thing.
I loved talking to Kelly. I could have chatted to her for another hour. What an incredible woman. She's clearly as natural in person as she is on our screens. If you'd like to hear about the career paths of other trailblazing women in sports media, my previous guests on the podcast include Claire Balding, Jackie Oatley, Gabby Logan, Jess Crichton and Ellie Oldroyd. In fact, you can find out more about all 66 guests from this and the previous series at fearlesswomen.co.uk, and that's also where you can see more of the other work that I do, including the Women's Sport Collective, a network for any women working in sport. Thanks again to Barclays for their ongoing support of the Game Changers, and also to Sam Walker from What Goes On Media, who does a great job as executive producer of the podcast. Do come and say hello on social media, where you'll find us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at The Game Changers or at Sue Anstiss. I can't wait to share next week's guest with you, Anita Asante, a hugely prominent figure in the footballing world. She's a former Lioness who currently plays at Aston Villa in the FA WSL. Anita has 71 caps in a career that spans 14 years and played in 2 World Cups, 3 European Championships, and she represented Team GB at the 2012 Olympics. Along with her career as a professional footballer, Anita now spends time talking about women's sport in her roles for the BBC and Sky Sports. She's a passionate ambassador for equality, working with charities including Show Racism the Red Card and Amnesty International UK.
Being part myself of the LGBTQ plus community, I think we're always on that side of having to talk about the issues that affect our communities, which impacts me personally and it impacts people around me, people I care about. So having the platform that I have, I think it's important that I show up, making sure that policies and things that affect our society don't get rolled back when people have worked so hard to get us to this point. And it's no different to women's football. It started with pioneers who have led us to this point, and they've pushed really hard by being there, being visible, by doing it against all odds. And now it's for the next generations onwards to carry that torch so that it can't be rolled back, and those opportunities will continue to exist for the next generation.
The Game Changers. Fearless women in sport.